Hey there, in this video I'll be building this Outfeed table. Now this table doesn't only offer me a nice slick surface for my boards to run across, but also gives me a nice open space for larger storage items. If you are interested in any of the tools or supplies I use in this build, I will leave a link for those in the description below. Enjoy the video. Now for the base of this table I used construction grade Southern Yellow Pine 2x12s from Lowe's. I began breaking these down at the miter saw station, and then I ran each board through the table saw. Now while breaking these boards down, it's best to leave at least 1/4 of an inch longer and wider than what their final dimension will be. This will allow me to mill all the pieces and not have to worry about taking off too much. Now I like to clean up all 4 sides before glue up, so I ran each board through the joiner, cleaning up one face and one side, followed by running the boards through the planer to clean up the remaining face. And then I returned to the table saw to get a perfect edge on the 4th and final side. Now it was time to begin gluing up what will make up the 6 legs and all of the stretchers. I grabbed some parallel clamps and began spreading the glue evenly across the boards. And then I added a few more clamps to ensure even pressure throughout each board. I repeated this same process for all of the legs and all of the stretchers. After letting everything dry, I began removing each piece from the clamps. I followed that by milling them down to their final thickness, which is 3 by 3 inches. I also cut them down to their final length at the miter saw station. After that, I have my 6 legs, 4 side stretchers, and 4 front and rear stretchers. Now the joinery I use for the base of this table are loose tenon dowels. I began by using my doweling jig to drill out the holes in each leg, and then matching each hole to the adjoining stretcher. After that, it was time to begin assembling the sides together. I applied glue to each piece along with the dowels and began working on a snug fit so I could apply the clamps. This is just one of the 2 sides, as I repeated the same process to make the second. Now while all those were drying, I needed to make some half-lap joints on the 2 middle legs and front and rear stretchers. After finding the center of each piece, I scored a line with my utility knife, giving me an exact measurement. And then I took these pieces to the table saw and installed a dado blade and set the height of the blade to remove exactly half of the marked section of the stretcher. You could also use this joinery method on all of the corners if you do not have a doweling jig. You will have a better understanding of this joint when I show the middle leg being applied to the base here in a little bit. Now all the pieces for the base are ready to be assembled. So I removed the sides from the clamps and began inserting the dowels with glue and pressing all 4 stretchers into place. And then I repeated the same process by inserting and gluing the dowels into the other end of the stretchers. I followed that by grabbing the other side and pressing it on top of those dowels. To get everything snug together, I used my mallet and a scrap piece of wood to knock down the other side piece. I then pulled the base down onto all 4 feet and began applying the bar clamps and let it sit until the glue dries. Next, it was time to install the middle legs to the base using the half-lap joints that I grooved out earlier. There is no need for dowels or screws for this. I only used glue and clamps for each joint. Now to anchor down the top of the table to the base, I decided to use pocket hole screws. So I took my Craig jig and ran around the top stretcher, drilling out several pocket holes. And after that, I made some cross support pieces for the tabletop to prevent it from sagging over time. I drilled out 2 pocket holes on each end of these supports and 2 pocket holes in the up direction that will screw into the bottom of the tabletop. For the bottom shelf, I added 2 cross supports just like I did for the top, and a cleat on each end of the base with wood screws. Now I designed these bottom supports for the bottom shelf to sit inside of the stretchers instead of on top of them. I then turned the base on its side and used my router with a roundover bit to soften all the edges. This will prevent splintering and improve the overall appearance of the table base. If you do not have a router, you can go around with a sander and accomplish a similar result. Then I proceeded to flip the base completely upside down with the bottom of the leg sticking straight up to add the leveling feet. After finding the center point of the leg, I drilled with a Forstner bit followed by a regular drill bit to allow for the leveler mount to sit inside of the leg. And then I added the 3 screws followed by the foot itself. Now after installing all 6 levelers, I flip the base back over and set it aside so I can begin working on the top. For the top I am using 3/4 inch MDF. To cut it to size, I have these gym floor mats to elevate the sheet off of the ground so I can use my homemade track saw and avoid cutting into the concrete floor. And yes, I probably should have been wearing my respirator. I then took the top and set it on top of the base so I could add a protective border around the edge. I did this by adding some MDF that was left over from the top. I apply glue and brad nails around the entire top, making sure everything stays flush with one another. I followed that up by adding some southern yellow pine left over from building the base. I also applied this by glue and brad nails, giving the top a final edge reveal of 1.5 inches thick. And after that, I flipped the top right side up and slid it into its final resting place and began anchoring it down with the pocket hole screws from the holes that I drilled earlier. Now it was time to get the top prepared for laminate. First, I sanded the entire top, removing any imperfections on the MDF and the protective border. To remove the dust, I grabbed a tack cloth and began wiping the top of the MDF and the bottom of the laminate sheet. Now it was time to apply the contact cement to the laminate sheet and the top of the table. By doing this, I used a foam roller and applied 2 coats to each. After that dried, I grabbed a few pieces of scrap wood to keep the 2 surfaces separated while I threw the sheet onto the table. After getting everything lined up, I pulled the first piece of wood out and began setting the sheet with my hand and continued removing the other pieces. I followed that up using the J-roller, hitting every single inch of the top. Now to prevent the edge of the laminate from chipping, I grabbed my router and went around the edge of the table with a chamfer bit. I also applied laminate to the bottom shelf and then slid it into place with no hardware because it sits inside of the stretcher and will also be loaded down with storage items. After I slid the Outfeed table in front of the table saw, I needed to route out a couple of notches so I would be able to use my sliding miter gauge. So I measured where the slots are on the table saw and transferred those measurements to the Outfeed table. Then I grabbed my framing square and marked off what I needed to remove with my router. To ensure I get a straight cut, I used a scrap piece of MDF and clamped it to my table and used it as a straight edge for my router. I used a 1/2 inch straight router bit and needed to make 2 passes per notch. At this point, the Outfeed table is ready for use, but I wanted to make it match the rest of my shop. So I slid it back over to my working space and removed the top and the bottom shelf so I could apply the finish. Now I didn't want to bore you with showing you the sanding process, but I will show you the whole song and dance with the stain and the polyurethane on the base and the protective edge on the top. This makes the wood grain really pop out of the wood and gives the table a nice overall appearance. After everything dried, I reassembled the top and bottom shelf. I then began installing these removable casters. While this step is optional, I believe that when I load the bottom shelf with storage items and want to move it, I will be glad that I added these. Now that the table is finished, the only thing left to do is to roll it into place and then unlock and remove the casters and level it to the table saw. Now you may have been wondering why one side of the top had a larger overhang than the rest. Well, this was to provide room for my dust collection hose to comfortably connect to my table saw without a sharp angle restricting the airflow. And with that, the Outfeed table is fully moved in and ready for use. I will leave a link for all the tools and supplies I used in this build in the description below. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video. And before you go, I'd like to share some good news with you, which is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, and whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Thanks again for watching.